COVID-19 pandemic is already a mighty storm and is still growing.
When DPM Heng announced the resilience budget in Parliament, my MOF colleagues and I were watching it on the TV screen in the MOF office.
The government has obtained President's in-principle support to draw up to $17 billion to fund some of the measures to save jobs and the economy.
I was the Director for Reserves and Investment. When you are in my role, it is our hope that we never have to draw on the reserve. So when I heard DPM's mouth these words, it was in some ways mixed feelings.
17 billion Singapore dollars wasn't even the end of it.
The bad news kept piling up, and the ask of the drawdown also kept going up.
As you can imagine, for all of us, our phones were ringing non-stop.
69 billion Singapore dollars. That was eventually how much Singapore was prepared to withdraw from the reserves to tide the country through the pandemic. Too big a sum to imagine? If we stack all that money up in $10 notes, it'd be higher than Mount Everest.
It was a culmination of weeks of feverish work, but also a feeling of uncertainty whether or not this would be enough.
We speak to those who had front row seats to the unfolding drama to bring you the untold story of the biggest drawdown from our reserves.
The budget speech every year is always a very significant government event because that's the time where the government lays out for the next 1 year its key policy and spending priorities. So the process will kick off November, December, January. As you enter towards the peak season, you'll start to see this table with snacks. Some of my colleagues from other ministries come into MOF for a meeting and they'll see the table and they say, oh, I see, so it's budget season.
The most popular snacks are things with cream, things with chocolate.
What I always remember is, of course, Hello Panda.
For most challenging times, we all go and get ice cream in the freezer.
During budget season, Zhi Jian's team will inform the government of the day how much they get to spend from the investment returns.
It was indeed in one of the regular meetings. What I remember distinctly was the discussion around the Wuhan lockdown.
Ikwe was immediately called in to forecast the impact of this news on the economy.
There were requests for us to size up the impact and then draw plans. You've got to do a lot of prep work, to do the analysis, to do the situational reports and so on in time for these meetings. The emails were fast and furious and easily 100, 200 emails a day.
Chinese researchers said investigations showed a new type of coronavirus was to blame.
When the first case of the virus surfaced in Singapore, Professor Vernon Lee was about to leave for a holiday to Bangkok with his family. He had to cancel. His team then began investigations into what this virus was all about.
The early reports were that this might be an animal-to-human transmitted disease. It's not much human-to-human transmission. That means that it would be rather containable, and the disease might not spread so quickly to the rest of the world.
In January, we're definitely not thinking of a very severe scenario.
I'm the Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Finance. This means I'm the most senior civil servant, so I lead a team of a few hundred officers to support the ministers in formulating policies on fiscal matters like taxation, government spending, and management of our reserves. So we provided some additional support in that budget. We put aside something like 6.4 billion additional just for COVID-related measures. We had enough resources to fund that additional budget. That's why we didn't need to think about drawing on past reserves.
Singapore has been managing its reserves or savings since self-governance.
Reserves is just a savings that the government has made.
Each term of government is 5 years. And the surplus within the current term of government will form the current reserves. Then of course, when you talk about past reserves, it relates to these surpluses that were accumulated by governments past.
Before the pandemic, this wealth was left largely untouched, except for one occasion.
Seismic shifts on Wall Street have plunged global markets into turmoil.
During the global financial crisis, Peter Ong was a leading civil servant at both the Ministry of Trade and Industry as well as the Ministry of Finance.
The cause of the global financial crisis went back to the subprime crisis in the United States.
People start to realize that the loans that are given by banks for housing are basically overvalued. This realization caused panic. People started to withdraw the money. There was a bank run in the US. Some banks collapsed. And suddenly, overnight, there's a financial crisis in the US.
Lehman Brothers operations in Singapore have come to a halt a day after it filed for protection from bankruptcy.
The share prices kept falling, from 3-digit to 2-digit to 1-digit. Then you have that kind of sense that this is really like financial Armageddon that's happening to us.
And suddenly, around the world, people started to lose confidence in one another.
Counterparties would no longer lend or borrow with each other.
Credit is the blood, is the oxygen of business to be done around the world. This blood flow stopped, right? So essentially, 40% of our economy is suffocated because there's no credit flowing around.
Singapore's economy is now expected to contract for at least 5 straight quarters.
We started to see, in a few months, retrenchments happening, growing, doubling, tripling.
Workers started to feel very insecure about their jobs, and they started to tighten their belts when it came to spending. And then it's kind of like dominoes that falls.
The speed at which things started to unravel became so drastic.
It was the worst recession since independence.
No sector, no industry was spared. What we felt was needed was a strong shot in the arm, a boost of confidence for the economy.
To save jobs and fast, the MOF team designed a jobs credit scheme.
So the government gave 12% credit for the first $2,500 of salaries to every employee in Singapore that's on the CPF payroll. This was our way to tell the employers, please do not cut jobs just to save costs. And secondly, the SRI, which is a special risk sharing initiative. We knew that banks were not lending. We expanded the risk share that banks make on their loans to their lenders.
SRI stands for Special Risk Sharing Initiative. Say a company takes out a bank loan under this scheme and defaults. If the bank tries but fails to recover the debt, the government will foot up to 80% of the debt. This gives banks more confidence to lend to companies.
What was fortunate for us was that we had a few good years of surpluses, and there were sufficient current reserves for us to finance these measures.
Kok Fat was then Director of Fiscal Policy. Each year, his team aligns government spending with national strategic priorities. In 2009, there was enough money in the government's coffers to fund both the Jobs Credit Scheme and the Special Risk Sharing Initiative. But no one knew how long the crisis would last.
I still remember vividly, we were called to a meeting. The minister informed us that he and the PM and his cabinet colleagues have decided that we will be writing to the president to ask the president for approval to use the reserves to finance these measures.
It would be the first ever drawdown of past reserves.
The minister explained, it's not just about whether or not we have the current reserves, but to signal to the rest of the world that we are prepared to provide all the support we can until the global economy recovers. And being able to say that we are using the past reserves will give that confidence. Because no matter what we say, even the fact of the matter is that no one knows how long this crisis will last.
The amount needed was 4.9 billion Singapore dollars. So began the process of drawing down from our reserves. After independence, dipping into the reserves was a decision that could be made by the government in power. But in 1984, then Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew mooted the idea of adding safeguards.
If there is a freak election result and a coalition forms the government, all the reserves are available. The larder is wide open. You can raid it.
In 1991, this safeguard was written into law. Beyond the first approval given by the government, a further approval would be needed, that of the elected president. The president has to approve any likely draw on the reserves, but he must first consult the 8 members of the Council of Presidential Advisers, or CPA. So who gets to sit on the Council of Presidential Advisers? The President gets to pick 3, the Prime Minister gets 3 picks, while the Chief Justice and the Chairman of the Public Service Commission have 1 pick each. So, in January 2009, then Finance Minister Tharman Shanmugaratnam brought the $4.9 billion drawdown request to President S.R. Nathan and the CPA.
They asked, would this set a bad precedent for future requests by the government? Was there a necessity to draw on past reserves when the government still have current reserves at that time? The Finance Minister sought to address each one of this. Our key argument for drawing on past reserves were twofold. Number one, the situation that we face at that moment. Unprecedented, not just in Singapore but around the world. Secondly, on the specific nature of the measures, we made the point that the measures that were being proposed, namely the Jobs Credit Scheme and the Special Risk Sharing Initiative SRI and JCS, were meant to be temporary and once-off.
11 days after the briefing, President S.R. Nathan approved the drawdown request.
So for the first time, the government is dipping into its reserves. It will draw $4.9 billion to fund 2 temporary and extraordinary measures.
In the past, when Singapore was building up its fiscal reserves, there was always a lot of questions about we are saving up for a rainy day. When is the rainy day coming? The 2008 global financial crisis proved that it was a rainy day, and Singapore basically had that big umbrella to take out and to shield, the Singapore economy from the worst effects of that downturn.
Beginning of 2009, we were expecting the economy to decline by about -2 to -5, the deepest in 4 decades. By 2010, our economy rebounded so sharply that we registered a GDP growth of 14.5%. Unprecedented.
A decade later, Singapore would face a far greater crisis, one that would require 10 times the drawdown. At the end of February 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic was crippling global healthcare systems. Country after country enacted global air travel restrictions. Meanwhile, Singapore was in the middle of its annual budget debate, which included 6.4 billion Singapore dollars for COVID relief measures.
As the budget debate was going on, you could see some of the numbers ticking up in Europe.
During budget season, Peter's team, Fiscal Policy, is the central pivot at the MOF. They are the ones who put together the key numbers announced during budgets. Peter and his team were sensing that the budget they crafted was already outdated.
We got a sense that this is no longer a containable kind of pandemic. And that's where we started to develop the plans. In COVID, you can't wait for all the information, you can't wait for a perfect design, because the cost of not acting is far more than the cost of acting with limited information.
The crystal ball was foggy, it wasn't clear at all. Some of the regular data that we look at comes out with a lag, and sometimes the lag could be as long as 3 months. So also returned to less conventional data, flight arrivals, the daily visitor arrivals. We were looking at hotel cancellations. We were also tracking the state of restaurant booking in the various economies. It was clear that compared to pre-COVID, there was no activity, and you have no activity means you've got no GDP.
COVID-19 is now officially a pandemic. The World Health Organization made that declaration.
This happened 21 days after the original budget was submitted.
The response that the government had to mount would have to become bigger, more decisive, and reach all Singaporeans and all businesses.
Obviously, aviation was the first hit. And then subsequently, our domestic services, restaurants, F&B, and so on.
How do we design the scheme such that we can give the firms the confidence to hold on to their workers?
We do so by helping employers pay for part of the wage cost for these workers.
The MOF team launched the Job Support Scheme, or JSS, in February 2020. It was modelled after the successful 2009 Jobs Credit Scheme. This was initially set at 8% of the first $3,600 of wages paid to local employees. But when the economy worsened, the MOF team decided to raise the support level to between 25 and 75% of the first $4,600. But this would be very costly.
When we put the numbers together, it was quite clear that we did not have enough resources, so therefore drawing on the reserves became the next step.
The first briefing to the President at the CPA was almost about 4 hours, and there were a lot of questions.
I don't think any of us took approval from the President for granted. We did not assume that she would say yes.
The President will consult the CPA and get their views on whether or not to agree with the government's proposal. Between the CPA and the President, we do not have to agree.
When a request is made for the drawdown, each CPA member gets a vote. The President is given the results of the voting. If the President says no, and the majority of the CPA says no, then Parliament cannot override the veto. If the majority of the CPA says yes to the drawdown, but the President says no, Parliament can override the President with a 2/3 majority.
We had many meetings, and those meetings actually don't last just half an hour. They lasted a few hours because we need to ask questions, we need to be satisfied, we wanted more information. We have our role to protect the reserves and to make sure that the government's request is reasonable.
We expect good answers from ministers and ministries.
Is this a valid use of past reserves? Why this amount? All the measures that you say you're going to put in place, are they going to be effective?
What are the programs that we're going to introduce? How would you unwind this?
I was quite honest with them that actually things were still very highly uncertain at that point in time.
Singapore President Halimah Yacob has given her in principle approval to draw on past reserves.
I think it's one of the defining points of my presidency. It is a pandemic that we've never seen before, and of such a scale and gravity, and it's a double whammy in terms of both health and economic perspectives. It is also a learning moment for all of us that we were fortunate, we had very good governance, and we had a very good reserves base where we could use it in order to take care of the needs of Singaporeans.
With the President's approval in hand, the MOF team raced to finalise another budget that would be known as the Resilience Budget. This budget would outline how the money from the reserves would be used to help support workers. Meanwhile, the global situation was deteriorating sharply, and as more countries closed their borders in March 2020, there was a possibility that the sum asked for would not be enough.
On 3 consecutive days, 23rd, 24th, 25th March, Minister Heng wrote to the President on each of these days, informing her of the government's plans, because the news kept piling up and the ask of the drawdown also kept going up.
This circuit breaker will apply for 1 month in the first instance.
So the announcement of the circuit breaker really was like D-Day, I think, for everybody.
I think the first tendency for many of these firms is to let go of their workers.
All businesses that were not allowed to open for 1 month. We had to quickly put together yet another budget called the Solidarity Budget to offer the highest tier of job support scheme at 75%.
It was important that we were able to act fast so that in the public's mind, they know that, okay, now things have taken a further negative turn. But at the same time, the government has come in with more support.
But this meant yet another draw on Singapore's reserves to the tune of 4 billion Singapore dollars.
Just imagine the team in MOF basically drafting the letters, summing up the numbers. One stage, I even just went and stood behind this guy who was furiously typing on his computer to say, "Can you work faster?" The minister wrote to the president on the 3rd of April, and there were certain parliamentary processes that had to be done. The sequence of events was really very compressed in time. And on the 6th of April, he went to Parliament to unveil the Solidarity Budget.
3 budgets within just 48 days. The 3 budgets make up our largest budget in any one financial year, in dollar amount and as a percentage of GDP. This is the largest spending in any financial year in our nation's history.
In the space of 2 weeks, the President approved up to a $21 billion draw on reserves to help support workers. That's 5 times what Singapore eventually drew from the reserves during the 2009 global financial crisis.
We will extend the circuit breaker for 4 more weeks beyond the 4th of May. In other words, until the 1st of June.
With the extension of the circuit breaker, more money was needed, and this time, the ask from past reserves was much larger, an additional 31 billion Singapore dollars. This would be the 3rd time the team had to write to the President.
And there was always, how long will this crisis last? We could not communicate an exit strategy even to the President CPA.
In May 2020, just before Singapore exited circuit breaker, President Halimah Yacob approved this additional draw on the reserves. All in all, Singapore will spend a total of 72.3 billion Singapore dollars fighting COVID. The President approved a draw of up to $69 billion. Eventually, only 40 billion was used from past reserves. The rest came from our operating budget. This money, put on standby, went into paying for public health measures, making it possible for Singapore to make early bets on vaccines and be one of the first populations to be fully vaccinated. While the bulk of the funds went into subsidizing the wage bill of the worst-hit businesses, saving over 165,000 jobs.
We continue to be in a tight fiscal position. It is therefore highly unlikely that we will be able to put back what we have drawn from past reserves.
After the worst of the pandemic, we resumed interactions with our international counterparts virtually, exchange notes about COVID, and also how our counterparts in other countries dealt with it. And for them, the answer was quite a straightforward one. They borrowed. They incurred higher debts in order to fund their own COVID-19 response.
While Singapore spent some 15% of its 2020 GDP fighting COVID, on par with advanced economies like Japan, USA, and the UK, it was one of the few that borrowed nothing.
And there's no magic to it. When you have borrowed, you will need to repay it either by raising taxes or by cutting spending.
Singapore will lift all remaining COVID-19 measures from next Monday as the situation stabilizes and the country prepares to return to normal life.
Many of the debates, budget debates in fact, even 2019, right, this is where the plans of GST were raised. there was very rigorous debate about, why are you keeping the reserves for? Why do you use it? So going through this, it's very clear in my mind that crisis can happen. And the world is fundamentally uncertain. So in some ways, it has certainly anchored that confidence, confidence in both the judgment from our predecessors that the reserves should be used carefully and used decisively in crisis.
Having sufficient reserves helped us to avoid worrying whether we had sufficient resources and helped us to focus on the problem at hand. Having the reserves helped us to weather COVID a lot better than if we did not have this resource available.
As I reflect on this, my colleagues and I in MOM are just very, very lucky that we are able to benefit from this ability to draw down on past reserves. Not due to our talent or effort at all. Something which people who came before us left for us.